Hey gang, I had a great conversation with William Deresiewicz, who is the author of a new collection of essays, which is titled The End of Solitude. We talked about his critique of academia, his critique of technology and social media, what he thinks undergraduate education should really be for, and we talked a bit about Harold Bloom, the late literary scholar. I hope you enjoy the episode, and if you do, leaving a 5-star review is a great way to help other people find the show. Thanks. Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Bill Deresiewicz. Bill, could you please introduce yourself?
I can, although you did such a beautiful job pronouncing my name. Uh, Bill Deresiewicz, or William Deresiewicz on my byline, author of a few books, and now the most recent one is called The End of Solitude, Selected Essays on Culture and Society, which is a collection of essays that I've written over the last, well, it goes back almost 30 years, but most of them are from the last 15 years, and there's several that are new and have not been published before.
Well, congratulations on the book, and thanks for coming back on the show
Yeah.
to talk about it. We last talked, I guess, about 2 years ago about your book, The
Yeah.
Death of the Artist.
Yeah.
And by the time this episode airs, this book will be available from wherever fine books are sold, and people can get it. So, how did you, selected essays on culture and society? How did you select? What were you thinking about this as like a cohesive work, and how did you decide what to include from things you had previously written,
Oh,
and
yeah.
what to leave out?
No, that's a good question because I didn't conceive of it as a cohesive work. I conceived of it as no, I didn't. I mean, except insofar as I wrote them all, which is not nothing. I mean, it's my sensibility, it's my point of view. Also, maybe as it develops over the years, although the pieces aren't in chronological order, I selected them because I thought they were the best ones I've written and the ones that are the most worth reprinting. There were a few that I really liked, but I thought maybe they're too topical, too specific to the time they were written. But for the most part, you know, I just wanted to have, some of the essays are still circulating widely. Many of them are not. Many of them have just kind of would otherwise be lost. And I wanted to put them between the covers of a book and just sort of say, like, here, this is me. This is the best thinking that I've done over the last, many years, really, at this point. And then, once I did that, or as I was doing that, I started to see, I knew that there would be certain thematic clusters that I would emphasize by grouping them together into the different parts of the book. I think there's 7 parts or 6 parts to the book. So there's a section on technology culture, meaning, life on the social media platforms mainly. There's a section on higher education. I was an English professor for a long time. I've written about that a lot. There's sections on the various arts and on intellectuals who have meant a lot to me, and so on. It was only when I came time to write the preface, I knew that, okay, I have to write a preface. And in order to write a preface, I've got to be able to say something about what binds all this stuff together. And I, it's really what I talked about, what I talk about there is something that I've been thinking about more and more recently, really in the course of writing some of the last essays that have made it into the book, which is this was in the last book too, The Death of the Artist and how the arts are changing. I think the self is changing. I think under the pressure of social media, and I think now we can talk about what's been going on with progressive politics, but especially social media, which is whatever may be true of progressive politics, social media and the internet more broadly is here to stay. I think it's not even just disrupting, but maybe disintegrating a kind of selfhood, a kind of personhood that I think I took for granted when I was younger, but is a historical phenomenon with a clear beginning and seems to be on its way to having a clear ending. What am I talking about? The notion of being an individual. I discovered not too long ago from a book by Joshua Cohen that the word individual, in the sense we mean it, being an individual, was coined by Rousseau. in the late 18th century. It did not exist before.
And then this
And
is Joshua Cohen, the philosopher.
Joshua Cohen, the novelist, an
Oh,
essay.
okay. If a former guest on this program in that
Yeah,
case.
and an extremely smart person who knows a lot about a lot of things. He's got a book called Attention, right? It's a collection of his essays. I reviewed it for the Times Book Review. And it's in the course of that he was, I don't remember the exact context that he brought it up, but it makes perfect sense to me because the late 18th century was the seedbed of so much of what we think of as characteristic of modernity, right? It's when industrialism starts to gather momentum. It's the age of the revolutions in the United States and France, the age of a new articulation of rights, of what it means to be a citizen rather than a subject of the, of a king. Ideas and even words like privacy. And so this new conception of a self starts to take shape, where you define yourself, at least in part, not according to the group you belong to or the tradition that you were born into, but against those things for the sake of defining your own unique selfhood. And you did that in a lot of ways, but you did it, I think, centrally through reading. Not only does literacy become widespread for the first time, but silent reading, right, becomes a thing. It didn't used to be. Reading used to be a group activity, mainly because you couldn't afford that many books and not that many people knew how to read.
Mm-hmm.
So and just the fact that we started to build houses. Witold Rybczynski, the great historian of architecture and especially domestic architecture, talks about how for the first time you start to build houses, middle class or bourgeois houses, where people got their own room. And so you could actually withdraw into a space of privacy or solitude as part of, physically distinguishing yourself from everyone else around you. And you read, you sort of dove deeply into another consciousness and therefore into your own consciousness. The function of art, including visual art and musical art and dramatic art, became transformed. And central to it was this idea of sort of the individual encounter, the self-conscious shaping of your own personhood. This is a very long way to answer your question and explain what I very briefly say in the preface, which is that I think what holds the collection together is that one way or another, these are either about defining and defending that conception of the self against the various things that I think are besetting it now, or simply trying to enact it. It's a record of my best attempt to be an individual, which is, and this is sort of another thing that's crystallized for me in recent years, is an ongoing project. It's not something you can ever take for granted. It's something you have to work on if you care about it all the time.
Let's start with the title essay, which is also the first one after the preface. And The End of Solitude, 2009, I think is.
Yeah, that's right.
When it's from. You've touched on this somewhat, but why did you decide that this would be the title essay and also the first one? And
right.
what spurred you to write it 13 or so years ago at this point?
Yeah, right. So to take your questions in order, I thought that this, more than anything, that title, more than anything, encapsulated what I was just talking about, because that piece is about how solitude is essential to this, again, not just this conception of the self, but this enactment of the self, this practice of selfhood. And it's also one of the oldest essays in the book. I said most of them are from the last 15 years. So I thought it would be a good place to start because it kind of launches a certain line in my thinking. So we go from that essay in the book, as I did in my life, from the end of solitude to solitude and leadership, which is an address that I gave at West Point subsequent to this, that has circulated very widely. And then there's an essay about friendship that's kind of a pendant to the End of Solitude, because that one is about how social media is deforming our practice of friendship. So it's kind of, it's sort of thematically perfect, and I think chronologically perfect for me to start with, even if it isn't literally the oldest piece of the book. How I came to write it, well, it really had to do with the other most well-known piece called The Disadvantages of an Elite Education, which I wrote in 2008 as I was leaving Yale as an English professor, leaving academia. And it was a way to articulate the problems I was seeing with my students. And we can talk more about that.
Hmm.
That's the piece that starts the second section. It's the piece that eventually led me to write Excellent Sheep, which I think is the book that I'm best known for. If people know me at all, came out 8 years ago. But in the course of the disadvantages of an elite education, and I'm talking about how the incessant busyness and really anti-intellectualism of the kind of achievement rat race that elite students go through, both in order to get into elite colleges and then when they're there, and then potentially for the rest of their lives. In the course of that, I talk about a moment in the classroom where it was actually a course in the literature of friendship. But one day we got around to talking about solitude. And I was talking about the importance of solitude. And one of my students said, "Why would anybody ever want to be alone? What can you do by yourself that you can't do with other people?" And another student said, I wish I could be alone, but I just can't. I'm not capable of it anymore. And even when I have to write a paper, I'll go to a friend's room and I'll sit there and I'll sit with her and I'll write my paper and she'll do whatever she's doing. So that essay came out, and Evan Goldstein, who's a great editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, pointed to that. This is one of the things that a really good editor can do. He picked out that thread and said, "Hey, do you want to write an essay about the decline of solitude?" So I said, "Yeah, maybe. Let me think about it." And what I thought about, sort of the real work of that piece that became The End of Solitude, was to try to figure out, like, if I want to defend solitude as a value, one question I wanted to answer for myself and my readers is was this just a phenomenon of another one of these phenomena that just existed in the 18th century, or that just started in the 18th century, like privacy and other things like that? And it's historically contingent. And, I could see the argument being like, well, so what? I mean, it's just, we don't, people lived without it for a long time. I mean, you get that kind of sort of semi-stupid argument about things like that. And in thinking about it, what I realized is that that's true and it's not true. That as a universal value, something that everyone should aspire to have in their lives, solitude really dates from that time. But there is a long tradition of solitude, specifically in a religious context. We have hermits and prophets who kind of are, the Bible tells us about a prophet going off into the wilderness and hearing the voice of God. What does that mean? I don't understand that literally. What I understand that to mean is that it is in solitude that we can come into contact with ourselves and the world at a deeper level. We can hear wisdom. We can hear, quote unquote, the voice of God. And what happened in the 18th century, as it happened to a number of important things, is that that concept became both secularized and democratized. So this thing that had been a possession, sort of a possession of a relatively privileged leisure class. I mean, you don't think of a hermit as a leisure class, but someone is supporting, I mean, people are supporting, those religious figures are supported, or monks, they were supported by tithes, right?
Yeah,
Or
so
they
the
were
begging
supported by
bowl
the
or
noble.
something like
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
exactly. Or church tithes, right? I mean, it wasn't that, it was big up. The Catholic Church had a big operation, still does. So it was for the sake of creating what you might call leisure, for the sake of study, but also of contemplation. And now this idea of contemplation is something that we recognize is everyone is capable of, and everyone should have the freedom, the opportunity to do. I mean, this is also an important idea for education going forward. So that's kind of the crux of that essay, is like, this is a thing we've been doing for a long time, that we've recognized the value of for millennia. This is a thing that for centuries now we felt belongs to everybody, but it is a thing that we seem to be losing.
Um, there's a lot of places we could go from this. It's interesting to think that this was sparked by one of your students saying, the Why would you ever want to be alone? If I'm writing a paper, I want like my friend there
Yeah.
hanging out with me. I mean,
Yeah.
the college is a time when, and most students who are going to elite colleges probably had their own bedrooms, and then they are suddenly pushed into usually like a double or something with a stranger, and that's their first roommate who isn't a sibling, or maybe their
Uh,
first roommate ever. So in some ways, and you're thrown into a pool with a bunch of people you don't know before, whereas the kids you knew in high school were, you probably know them for a long time. So there's an interesting sort of, if the standard college student writing a paper, his or her roommate might be writing a different paper right next to them. So there's entering the modern, residential university system. The kids are giving up some solitude.
well, I would dispute that a little bit. I mean, my guess, my educated guess, is that generally speaking only applies to first year students. I lived in a double when I was a first year student. Almost everybody. I went to Columbia, at least at that time. Almost every freshman lived in a double. But after my freshman year, I had my own dorm room, and almost all of the dorms were singles, right? So I think it's really only something that happens freshman year. And we can speculate why it happens. I mean, it saves them having to build another building, but it's probably also because they really want to get people to mix socially for the reasons you just said, because you're encountering other people, sort of other kinds of people for the first time. But generally speaking, I think a college student for most of their time has their own room. And actually, you're reminding me, I think I say this in that essay that, or I might have cut it out when I revised it a little bit for the volume, that Emerson said that if you can only say one good thing about college, he said it in an Emersonian way, but he said, at the very least, college gives you your own room. I mean, he was talking about the Harvard of the gentleman of the 19th century, but he was like, if it does nothing else, it gives you your own room. And he's specifically talking about the value of privacy and solitude and being able to think for yourself in an uninterrupted way or read for yourself in an uninterrupted way. So my student, I mean, my guess is that, I'm sure, I didn't ask her, but I'm sure the student who said that, who was, I think, a junior at that point, I'm sure she already had her own room,
Mhm.
which is why she had to go to a friend's room.
Right.
Right. But she could have just stayed in her own room. And I think the problem is that for various reasons we can talk about, either students no longer feel comfortable being alone, or when they are alone, and people have talked a lot about how alone students have been during the pandemic, they're alone, but it's not what I call solitude, right? For me, solitude isn't the objective state of being alone. It's a certain way that you use that state. And we all know that not only college students, but really everybody, when we're alone now, we almost invariably need to fill that solitude, that aloneness, with the internet, with some kind of connection that makes
Right.
us feel not alone.
Right. So the period in which one is alone with one's thoughts is much slower than it used to be. And I was joking a couple of months ago on Twitter, of course, where I type out all my jokes, that aimless staring has really gone downhill over the
Yeah,
past 15 years.
yeah,
Because if you were like meeting someone somewhere and you were early, um,
yeah,
20 years ago, you would just either you brought something to read with you, maybe you had a
right.
Walkman or something, but most likely you're just sort of standing there staring and seeing, looking around trying to see when they would show up. And that you don't need to do that anymore. You can look at your phone. And especially if you're by yourself, that's certainly not seen as rude or anything, just looking at your phone standing on the street. And, people do that when they're in company as well. So just that sort of like, yeah, period where you are not, you know, you're not choosing what to distract yourself with. That universal internet connected phones have really, have really eliminated
No,
that period when sort of a an idea or a reflection or something might come to you.
no, I think this is a tremendously large thing. I mean, you're laughing about it a little bit. I understand because it's also kind of an absurd situation, but I think this is an enormous thing. And it actually, it post dates my essay on the End of Solitude 2009. I forget exactly when the iPhone debuted. I think it was around then,
I think it
but
was
it didn't.
'08 was the
I think it
iPhone,
was
but
'08
it
too.
wasn't widely taken
It
up,
was
you know,
not
for
widely taken up until about 5 years later. That's exactly right. So uh, even when I wrote this, I was really just writing about Facebook primarily. But Facebook, when you walked away from your laptop, you walked away from Facebook.
Mhm.
And now it's exactly what you just say. In every single moment, because we've become so addicted to this stimulation, and I think so afraid of the absence of the stimulation, of being alone with ourselves, that whether it's we're waiting for someone, we're standing online at a store, whatever it is, right? We're just at home, right? And you said, it precludes the possibility of a random thought coming in. I would also say, and I think this is a big part of why people use it, it precludes the possibility of becoming too aware of our own emotions,
Mhm.
which can often be, difficult emotions. They can be loneliness, or they can be sadness, or whatever it is. But that leads to a profound disconnection from the self.
So in this piece, yeah, so it's, you wrote this piece before smartphones became sort of universal in America. And there's a couple specific things that you mentioned that are sort of out of date by this point. So one of them is you mentioned
Yeah,
Blackberries, which I,
right.
I don't even know. I think Blackberry did go bankrupt or something, but maybe the
I
brand
have no
still
idea.
exists.
Yeah,
And MySpace also, which
right.
essentially doesn't exist anymore. How did you think about, well, one, did you think about changing those things to, Twitter and iPhone to update it? And two, how do you think about, as someone who's writing, if you're writing an essay, trying to say something about the current culture, but especially technology, the way technology and culture interact, uh, it's going so fast now that you can, like, I don't know, like, there's a lot of think pieces about TikTok right now. I have no idea if TikTok
Right.
is going to stand the test of time. And in 3 years, people will be like, "Oh yeah, TikTok. Like, what was that thing again?" Like, who knows? But how do you think about that? Trying to say something meaningful about these things when it's constantly churning.
Right. So first of all, yeah, I know that MySpace you're the first person to mention BlackBerry, but a number of other people who've already interviewed me, talked to me for this book, have mentioned MySpace, because it so reeks of obsolescence, and it kind of brings people up short. So as I mentioned in passing, I didn't revise these pieces extensively. I wanted a record as my thoughts, but I did go through and, improve some sentences and some of the wording, and I'm pretty sure the first essay that I, started to do that with was The End of Solitude, because I knew it would be the first one in the book. And initially, I did take out MySpace and take out
Hmm.
Blackberries. And then, like the next day or something, I thought, I don't want to do it this way. Um, because these were thoughts from a very specific time. And once I start doing that, do I have to rewrite it now to talk about the iPhone? So instead, I supplied the date at the end of each essay. So that's how you know that this came out in 2009. It says it right on the page
Hmm.
after the essay, and all the other essays are like that. So I could preserve it as a record of a certain moment. And if MySpace brought you up short, as I guess it will bring up everybody short, it's a good, it's a good, it's a great reminder, very close to the start of the book, that these are each from a very specific historical moment. Now, how much have things changed? Well, we talked about the iPhone. I think that that's a big, big difference. In terms of social media in general, I mean, granted, I'm not on TikTok, and
nor am I.
right, it's a pretty generational thing. I have an Instagram account, but only because every once in a while I want to go on Instagram to look at, I might want to look at something, but I'm not active on Instagram. But so I may be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong in saying that the dynamic of each of these is basically the same. I mean, they each function somewhat differently, but it's all basically the same idea. You're connected to various people, you have a feed that you can scroll through, or some other way of, sort of scrolling, sort of monitoring. You have an opportunity to to construct a self, to construct a persona on the platform. Um, so I actually don't think that things have changed that much in that respect. And I would also say, I was thinking about this a lot for the death of the artist, that there was this huge burst of innovation in the internet, Web 2.0, basically in the first decade of the century. And that's when you get Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and the iPhone and a million other things. And since then, it really hasn't maintained that same pace. I mean, TikTok, I think, is the thing that you'd most obviously point to and say, this is a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I would, and I think we thought, 20, 15, 10 years ago that it would just be one new thing after another on a virtually monthly basis. Hasn't really worked out like that. And I think that this was also true of sort of the burst of innovation around the beginning of the 20th century, the airplane and the car and the phone. The phone is a widespread thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then it settled down. And I think what we see is, obviously I could be wrong, but I think the internet is kind of, crystallizing into the form that it's going to take more or less for the foreseeable future. So I think this is the shape that our consciousness is going to have. And I should also say that even if there are significant changes, the internet slash social media slash the iPhone in general, this is just how it's going to be. This is the human future. No, I mean, it's sort of
If you want a
obvious.
vision of the future, yeah, it's
Well, I mean,
dispiriting to think about.
it's dispiriting, and I think that's why. I mean, I guess intellectually I kind of knew that, but it only hit me like a few weeks ago, like because I mean, I guess because I'm from before, so I have a memory. So there's the possibility exists in my mind that it doesn't, that doesn't have to exist, but there's no reason to believe. I mean, the phone hasn't gone away; it's never going to go away. Why should it? So this is the future, and we need to come to terms with it.
Yes, that makes sense. And I guess there's some hype around like Web 3, but that seems to have largely fizzled out. Who knows what'll
Yes.
happen next? It's always possible there will be something new or some sort of move away from just because people get sick of something. And Facebook was dominant for 10 or so years, but I think most young people are not on Facebook because they think it's boring or corny or something, and they don't
Right.
want their parents seeing what they're into or their grandparents. And so maybe, and it's also a poorly run company that has done a lot of unethical things. So there's sort of some revulsion around that. There could be changes, but yeah, an entirely new form. It seems, well, it's hard to conceptualize at this point.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and most of it is it turned out to be pretty bad. So
Yeah.
that's unfortunate as well. So when I was about halfway through the collection, I was describing to someone what the book was about, and I said something like, that sort of he writes a lot about education and higher education, and sort of the two big villains are neoliberalism and the students. And the students are so bad because of neoliberalism. And so I sort of joke about that, but you write a lot about higher education, but I think you really sort of excoriate every possible group, including yourself, when you write this essay about leaving
Yeah.
academia. And you also have a ideal or idealized or something vision of what a liberal arts education should be. Um, and basically every group connected to higher education is falling short of that. The students, the administrators, the faculty, and anything else connected to higher
Yeah.
ed is failing. So there's a lot to talk about here, and I don't, your excellent sheep came out a decade or so ago, which is a book I have not read, but I listened to a number of conversations that you had
Yeah.
and about the book. But I mean, what was my initial glib comment? How does that strike you?
Well, a bit glib. Um, listen, I want to make it really clear first that I don't, it's not that I hate the students or I'm against the students or I blame the students. I mean, I know I tend to write in a pretty, sometimes caustic, certainly frank way. And, um, and I think, and students in general are not what I wish they were, but they're young, and insofar as I think they're not going through college the right way, I don't blame them. Um, I think neoliberalism plays a role because of the way, I mean, basically, so that's the essay called The Neoliberal Arts. Harper's gave it that title. I really love that title because I talk about how neoliberalism, meaning uh, market fundamentalism, in other words, everything, the market should be everything, we should refer all problems to the market. The market is the source of all value and all values. Um, how does that play out in education? I mean, you hear politicians say this all the time, especially Republican governors, but not only Republicans. The purpose of education is to train people for the job market. So when it's K through 12, you hear about college and career readiness, but college really just means career, because when they talk about college, they talk about career readiness. So it's all about, as Scott Walker famously wanted to change the charter of the University of Wisconsin to say, serving the state's workforce needs. So that's the neoliberalism part. It's not the only part. I mean, that section starts with the disadvantages of an elite education. I don't really talk about neoliberalism, or wasn't something I was thinking about, at least with respect to higher education back in 2008. That's about the college admissions process. And the one word synonym for that is meritocracy. Now, I'm not against meritocracy if it means, quote unquote, hiring the best person for the job. I'm against what we call the meritocracy and how it's evolved, and first of all, how rigged it is, right? Because it's not like everybody has a fair shot. Basically, the elite college admissions did a very big pivot in the 60s away from sort of the old WASP elite. You're a boy, you were white, you went to a New England private school, and you had, you know, uh, prestige access, ready access to the Ivy League, to what we call meritocracy. And it was supposed to be fair. And in some ways it is fairer, but very quickly upper middle class and upper class parents figured out how to game the system by stuffing their kids with as many educational resources as possible. And this is why you have these enormous class skews in the student populations of fancy colleges. I mean, typically I was just looking at these numbers, between about 65 and 85% of students at highly selective colleges come from the top 20%. And often as many as 15 to 20% come from the top 1%.
Hmm.
But it's not like the old pre-meritocracy where they're just basically their ways being bought in. The money is laundered through what the kids are expected to do, which is to become achievement machines, as David Brooks called them a long time ago, and do a dozen AP courses and a dozen extracurriculars and all the crap that we know about very well, which is what Excellent Sheep is about. And that produces kids who, they don't know what the hell they want to do with their lives. That's the biggest problem, right? And they have no conception of what an education might mean for them. So you say, I have this idea or this idealized version of a liberal arts education. And I'm not saying you're doing this, but I'm very wary because a lot of people have said, oh, it's just nostalgia. And worse than that, it's nostalgia for a time that's never existed. And
Uh-huh.
and I guess I've never really responded in this way before, but you've thankfully given me a chance. The form of liberal arts education that I want everyone to have a chance to have exists. It's not a pipe dream. It's not something from the golden days or something that ever existed. It exists mainly in specific classrooms of teachers who are dedicated to it, of students who care enough to want to put themselves through it, and in a few cases, at a few colleges, that have devoted themselves to it. Most obviously, the St. John's Great Books colleges.
Hmm.
So this isn't a fantasy. It exists. The problem is it gets no support. It gets no support from universities, from parents, from politicians, because most students go to public universities and colleges. So what the politicians think matters a lot. And instead, I think a lot of the money that goes into higher education and a lot of the time that students put into it is wasted.
So, the question, what is college for? What is the American college for? Is one that has a bunch of different possible answers. Probably the most common answer, if you polled 1,000 Americans, would be so you can get a good job.
Yeah.
Um, and that is not what you think college should be for.
Well, it's
So,
complicated.
so what would
Sorry,
you,
go
if
ahead.
if you were answering what is college for? How would
Yeah.
you answer it?
Yeah. I mean, so let me say, first of all, that there isn't just one answer to that question. I don't mean just that people have different answers. I mean that it isn't just for one thing, even in my opinion. I mean, college is like 4 years out of your life at the beginning of adulthood, typically. It needs to serve a number of different purposes, as I readily acknowledge. I mean, I readily advocate. I think one of the best things that the liberal arts can do for itself is to show students that they are useful for the rest of your life and even just your career. Okay. So they're not mutually exclusive. And I absolutely recognize, even if college were free, which I think it should be, even then you are at least devoting 4 years of your life, 4 years where you could be earning a living. College needs to absolutely help people get a better job. But here's the way I put it. I actually put it in a piece that just came out. So it came out too late to be in the book. It's in Liberties. It's called Soul Making Studies, and
Mhm.
it's a defense of great books courses. And what I say is that college needs to be practical. It needs to help you acquire the tools to achieve your goals. But it also needs to be liberal, meaning it needs to help you figure out what those goals should be in the first place. And that to me is a nutshell definition of a liberal arts education. Something that helps you think about what you want to do with your life. Think about what is worth striving for, as it's been put in slightly lofty language. What should you want? And then once you figure that out, or I mean, it's an ongoing process. Once you figure out how to figure that out on an ongoing basis, then you can decide. I mean, then go to a graduate school maybe and study medicine or study social work or study the arts or whatever you want, or go into the workforce and pursue your goals that way. Absolutely. But don't, but college is the time to step back from all the expectations that have been placed on you, all the static you're getting from society and often from your peers about what you're supposed to want, and start to figure out what you want. And generally speaking, you need help with that. You need help not being told what to want, but being told how to figure it out for yourself.
So let's see.
Does that make sense?
I I think so.
What was your college experience like?
Well, your book made me think about my college experience, and coincidentally, I went to college where you taught, and was an English major, which is what you taught, but I never took a class under you. Um, and I've had the chance. I mean, sort of the pandemic gave everyone a lot of chance to reflect on things when I wasn't being distracted by my phone. Um,
Uh-huh.
and it also, I was also laid off during the pandemic from my job at Blogging Heads, where this show used to exist.
Right.
And so one of the things I uh, was doing was, looking for a new job. And, so I was going over my resume and stuff like this and, reflecting back on my bright college years. So I enjoyed college. If I had to do it over again, I would not choose probably to, I would not choose something other than English, because I did enjoy being an English major. But what I sort of realized was one of the something I would do different if I could do it over was I definitely would have not have studied so much
Hmm.
because I mean, I don't know whether I was one of the excellent sheep or not, but in order to get into an Ivy League school, if you're not a legacy or a recruited athlete, you need to have
Right.
very good grades. You need to be good at standardized tests and yeah, do a lot of extracurriculars and just be lucky in some other way.
Yeah.
But the type of young person who is driven to get A's all the time and feels an A minus is sort of like a somewhat of a
Death.
disappointment, and then
Yes.
B plus, well, you really
Yeah.
screwed now. Like that was I sort of like gave myself that as a kid, and I don't know exactly where that came from,
Hmm.
but in college I just felt the same way.
Yeah.
Like if I needed to get straight A's, or not straight A's, but like anything below an A minus was somewhat of a
Right.
failure.
Right.
And you talk about this in the book, and this and so this is like led to great inflation in various ways because if a kid gets a B plus, they're like fighting with the professor over the grade or something. I never did any like grade grubbing or anything like that, but it was just like what I knew how to do, and the way to like please adults or something was to get good grades. And so I felt like I needed to keep on doing that, even though I didn't know what I wanted to do afterwards. There were vague ideas, maybe grad school, maybe law school, things for which your college transcript does matter. And I was competing against my fellow students, a lot of whom ended up going to postgraduate education, but I never did. And so my grades ended up not mattering. I mean, to my life, not mattering at
Hmm.
all. I've never had a job interview where they wanted to look at my transcript.
Huh.
So I worked quite hard in college, and I was probably somewhere around the 50th, percentile in terms of ability, or a little bit below. And I really knocked myself out in various ways. When looking back at it, there was no reason to, and I should have done various things, just like hung out more and like chilled
Yeah.
out a little bit more, just not to stress
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah.
But also like been more of a schmoozer or something and made more
Mm.
friends, which is all, making friends is usually good. But the type of people who go to Yale 10, 15, 20 years later, turns out that they, could be useful to you if you
Right.
are unemployed. Um,
Huh.
so, and there were people there at the time who sort of seemed like, canny operators. And
Yes.
my group of friends were sort of like, would turn up our noses at them, being like, oh, this guy's fake nice. He just wants everyone to like him, sort of thing. But just if I had just like been more social or met more people or something, it probably would have like helped my, helped my
Mm.
career. I probably wouldn't have gotten into a secret society, but I just would have, yeah, known more people who
Mm.
a dozen years later would be in the position to, help me out in some way. And another, I've been talking for a very long time, but I got the piece of advice that if you're looking for a job, you need to. It's very helpful for your LinkedIn profile to have over 500 connections,
God.
because then it says just 500 plus, and this
Uh-huh.
supposedly looks good. So I had around when I was laid off and spending time trying to polish my resume and stuff. I had like 200 or so. So I started spending time on LinkedIn, and anyone I had, anyone from my class whose name I recognized, I sent them a link, like a LinkedIn request.
Yeah.
And I noticed that a shocking number of people from Yale class of 2005 are now lawyers.
Mm,
Um,
yeah. Right. Well,
very few are medical doctors. There's some
huh.
professors. Now, I assume the type of person who makes a LinkedIn profile probably skews more
Right.
towards that line of work.
Right.
But there were like two people whose names I recognize who are now doctors, and like like
Well, I
75,
wonder if it's
100
also
who are lawyers.
wow. I wonder if it's also, I mean, maybe you're telling me this is not the case, but you were an English major, so you're more likely to know English majors and perhaps less likely to know uh,
Yes, it's possible, and there
biology
probably were
majors.
kids who were in the pre-med track who were, the science version of me, who were just like studying all the time because they wanted to get very
Right.
good grades. But
Right.
this residential college system, so there were people who I knew
Right.
vaguely who
Right.
were studying very different things from me. But yeah, it seems like
I mean,
that.
that's like, I mean, I think. you've brought this into focus for me that in a way that no one has before. But I think that the Yale English department and no doubt comparable departments at other schools are basically manufacturing centers for future lawyers, because that's what you do. I mean, you're not going to be a doctor if you graduate in English if you didn't also do pre-med, and et cetera, et cetera. Which is perhaps a little sad. I mean, I think what's sad is that between law, medicine, banking, finance, consulting, and tech,
Mhm.
that's the lion's share. I mean, well over 50% of graduates at most elite colleges now, highly elite colleges, whether it's Yale or a place like Pomona College or something. So, which suggests to me a lack of imagination, and that's part of what the title "Excellent Sheep" signifies. That you're just all going in the same few directions.
Right. And if it's an obvious, like, it's something I thought about. And it's, if have some talent with writing or words or
Yeah,
analyzing things, it's sort of a natural
yeah,
thing that makes sense, especially if you're like, well, what am I going to do with my life? How can I get a
yeah.
job? Graduate from law school, you'll probably be able to find some sort of job
Yeah,
as a lawyer.
I almost went to law school myself because I didn't know what else to do with my life.
Right. And a number of people I know my age who are lawyers do not like being lawyers and have either,
God, the
or either,
irony is, yeah,
yeah, some of them are no longer working, like using their legal, working as attorneys or whatever. They're doing something else. And some are just sort of like gutting it out. Um, but
yeah.
it does seem like something that a lot of people end up not, not liking.
Yeah. Another part of the problem with these are the five postgraduate occupational destinations for so much of the quote unquote best and the brightest is that uh, lawyers, doctors, and bankers are some of the unhappiest people in the country. I mean, like literally surveys of occupations and measures of subjective well-being or rates of substance abuse, suicide, divorce. I mean, no one's not no one. Lawyers and people who work on Wall Street tend to hate their jobs. Doctors also are often really miserable. um so what was the point? Well, they also make a lot of money and they're very high status occupations, but probably that's not worth the trade-off.
Yeah, and not everyone is working at some white shoe firm or
Yeah.
something. A good friend of mine from college is essentially a public defender, and someone who was a year below me in my residential college was on Mueller's team doing as part of
Mm,
the Trump
yeah.
investigation. And so yeah, it's not just people who are
Yeah.
looking to cash out. It's people who are, I assume they feel like they're doing something to
Yeah, and
help
they're
make the
probably
world a better
less.
place, which is another idea that you critique.
Yeah, I critique the concept of making the world a better place because it's become a meaningless cliche. If you really are making the world a better place, then good for you. Do you want to talk? Do you want to talk about that? Because it's become a very potent phrase, especially on college campuses now. Make the world.
Yes, and there's a couple parts of the book where you are talking about, yeah, sort of the buzzwords of the modern campus, and one of them
Yeah,
is leadership.
right,
And this is, you talk about this most in your essay that you delivered at West Point.
right,
Um, and yeah, creativity,
right.
diversity.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts
that's right.
on these buzzwords?
Well, there's a fair amount to say about all of them, but one of the things is that they're just meaningless feel good cliches. Leadership, that essay, Solitude and Leadership, as I mentioned earlier, started as a talk that I gave to the first years, the plebes at West Point, because I knew someone who was on the in the English department then, and she and a couple of colleagues saw the End of Solitude essay and asked me to come and talk to the plebes about solitude. And I figured they're not gonna care if this sort of bespectacled, pointy-headed intellectual starts hectoring them about solitude. So I tried to connect it to something that matters to them, which is leadership. The thing is that at West Point, it actually means something. In the Army, it actually means
Mhm.
something very different from what it means on most every other campus. On most every other campus, it means um, looking out for number one. it's about just it's self-aggrandizement. It's about getting to the top and getting as much for yourself as you can, not oh, being in service to other people, like putting the people you're leading first, sacrificing yourself or dedicating yourself to a higher cause, the stewardship of institutions or of a country. That doesn't mean any of those things. So I think it's really used as a signal. We're going to make you leaders. Everybody understands at a place like, I don't know, Harvard or Yale, that means, like I said, you're going to get to the top. You're going to have a lot of wealth and status and power. So it's a euphemism as well as a cliche. Creativity we can come back to. I don't know that it's the most exciting to talk about, but diversity. I mean, people have made this critique before. It's one of my main critiques of elite education. Yeah, there's diversity of skin color and of gender. There's very little diversity either of wealth, of socioeconomic background, right? I mean, I think I just heard these numbers once again, or this fact once again, that most students of African descent at Harvard and comparable schools are from affluent families, upper middle class or higher, and most of them are not descendants of American slaves. They're not what you might call African American. They are immigrants or children of immigrants from Africa or the Caribbean, and generally speaking, their parents are at least upper middle class, if not, like the wealthy family in Nigeria, the oligarchs. It's often true of students who come from South Asia as well. I had students like that.
There was a rumored African prince in my class.
Yeah,
I was never confirmed, but it very well could have been.
Yeah, and I taught a class in South Asian fiction for a few years, and I remember one year having a couple of students from Pakistan. I loved them; they were great kids. And one of them, I always ask my students, tell me about your family, whatever. And one of them kind of made it sound like his father was a farmer, and the other one, who was a good friend of his, explained to me later, like, no, what he was trying to say is that his father owns a significant part of the country, of the farmland in the country. So that's what we're talking. That this is what diversity looks like. And in terms of intellectual diversity, I mean, it wasn't even that bad when I was teaching. Left in 2008. By this point, 14 years later, for reasons I don't think we need to go into, intellectual diversity is actively stamped out at these schools. So I want to see real diversity. I mean, one, for example, the demographic group that is by far the most underrepresented is working class whites, right? Their working class whites are like 40% of the country, and they are virtually absent from elite college campuses, which I think is one of the reasons we have a leadership class, at least on the left half of the spectrum, that's completely out of touch with a large part of the country and didn't see Trump coming and still doesn't really know what to do with him or with his acolytes.
Can we talk about your Harold Bloom essay? And
oh, sure.
You mentioned Joshua Cohen, who his last book, which won the Pulitzer Prize, included a fictionalized version of Bloom, who he was in real life, the real Joshua Cohen was close to. And you wrote an essay that I guess was a review of a late Bloom book, The Anatomy of Influence. Was that what it was called?
Yeah, but I mean, there were so many of those and they were all interchangeable. I think it was called The Anatomy of Influence.
Right. And
I honestly don't even remember.
I think, and his breakout book was The Anxiety of Influence, and he's sort of revisiting this.
Yeah.
And and it's funny, he was a totally sui generis, if that's how you pronounce that word, figure in general, but on Yale's campus, he like left the English department. He arranged it so he didn't have to do any committee work or that he didn't want to do and attend any meetings he didn't want to. He was a sort of force of nature. And you mentioned that you basically never saw him in your time there. I audited a seminar he gave in Shakespeare when I was a senior, and that was an interesting experience in various ways. But what do you, and he passed away in late 2019, I think, shortly before the pandemic. And in just later years, he turned out these popular works of criticism of varying quality and opaqueness. What do you What do you think of Harold Bloom?
Yeah, I mean, this was an interesting piece to write. I should say, he had completely divorced himself from the department. The only thing he did was teach college students. And, good for him. That's the only thing I would have done if I had a choice. So not only no committee work, but no graduate teaching either. Um, I saw him, I think, three, it was so few times, and he was such a memorable figure that, they each of them implanted itself in my brain. And one of the times, I believe we were at adjoining urinals in the men's room on the third floor of LC, the English department's building on campus.
Mhm.
I did not strike up a conversation with him on that or any other occasion. I mean, Harold, as you say, Harold, everyone called him Harold a little presumptuously or pretentiously, but he was a world unto himself, as one of my graduate school professors said. He had an incredible mind. I mean, just a kind of freakish uh, uh, gift for absorbing and remembering literature. He read everything, and had an incredibly original mind. His career really, I talk about this in the book, really three phases. He's a critic of the Romantic poets, and he churns out one brilliant book after another, or brilliant essay after another, on Yeats, on Stevens, on the whole Romantic canon. The rumor was that they didn't want to tenure him at Yale because they didn't like Jews back then. I mean, it was a really anti-Semitic. The field of English lit was really anti-Semitic. It was really part of the construction of, like, quote unquote Anglo-Saxon culture. So they didn't want this very Jewy Jew around, but he published so fast that he didn't give him a choice. And then, he goes into his theoretical phase with the anxiety of influence, and subsequent books that kind of work out the consequences, the implications, the ramifications of this fairly abstruse theory. I mean, that's pretty hard stuff. His romantic criticism is transparent. It reads very easily. The theory is pretty hairy, and you know, I would read it fast precisely because it was easier to kind of read for drift than to get lost in the specific terminology. And then at a certain point, I mean, maybe, he this is not uncommon. You get to a certain age and you don't want to work so hard anymore. Or he sort of became this kind of public figure. I mean, I think because of the anxiety of influence and sort of this rumor that there was this genius, American, and and he's standing on equals with Derrida and so forth, and he sort of becomes this idea. And I don't know the details, but he clearly parlayed that, or found an agent who helped him to parlay that into this kind of, I call it a Wizard of Oz routine. I mean, he became this sort of pronouncer on all matters cultural. And so he churned out one book after another, on Shakespeare or on the Western canon, or the problem. And I read a bunch of them to do this review because this book was yet another one. The problem is, it's not that they're hard to understand, it's that he's not really saying anything. And he's not saying anything new. And it's an act, and it's an act that really got stale very quickly. So he was a great figure, but he just kind of became a kind of a kind of simulacrum of himself, he was impersonating himself. I mean, this, like I said, this happens to a lot of people. It can happen to musicians, it can happen to actors. So I tried to say all of that in the piece, and to give him his due, and then to lament the fact that not only this happened to him, but he became the literary critic. So everybody's idea of literary criticism was the late Harold Bloom, where you just kind of you just pontificate and pass judgments, and that's not really what it's about.
Yes, and so in the Western canon, he defined the Western canon according to his precepts, saying what things he thought should be in it and what things shouldn't. And that was maybe his first, like, mainstream huge success kind of thing. I mean, it's funny you said he decided not to work so hard. Obviously, well, someone was working extremely hard
No,
churning
no,
all
it's
this
true.
stuff out, but maybe, I
No,
mean,
it's
having
yeah,
original thoughts,
it's harder.
it's harder than
No, I mean,
doing this.
really, it really, the stuff just becomes extremely repetitive. Actually, now that you jog my memory, I think his first big popular success was the Book of J.
Oh, okay.
Right, which is about, the Book of J is one of the three narrative strands in the Book of Genesis, and someone else produced a new translation, and Bloom wrote the notes, which is kind of his own theory about how the author of J, who was he says is the great literary writer in the Bible, was a woman living in the court of King David or King Solomon, I forget which is just, I mean, there's absolutely no evidence for that. But it's him. I mean, it's an interesting book, but it's exactly him sort of doing this performance and claiming this right to make pronouncements even when he's really just bullshitting. And this, as opposed to the earlier work where it's like really, I mean, he's done the work to justify the argument, and now he's just, like I said, he's become this sort of Sybil, this kind of oracle who no one is holding to account. Because he's Harold Bloom, and the editors are happy, and he sells 1 million copies, and
Yeah, I mean, a singular figure, and there's no one who could replace him, or who
should replace him.
Yeah, who would like who's the runner up at this point for best known American literary critic or something? It's not someone who's like face you could pick out of a lineup,
Right.
for, I assume. Yeah, I mean, the experience of auditing that that seminar was quite interesting. I was both, since I wasn't enrolled in the class, I never raised my hand the entire time, but also I was too scared to say anything because he would, the class would start with him. It was Shakespeare, tragedies and romances, and so we'd be doing Winter's Tale, and he would ask a question, and one of the students would nervously
Make the mistake of actually answering. Yeah,
raise their hand and offer an answer, and he would say, no, that's not right. And then he would talk for 15 or 20 minutes uninterrupted, and it was cogent. I mean, it was much less sort of Gnostic or something than the writing. But it was an interesting experience, and I'm glad I was able to like see the guy in the flesh.
Right. Right. No, and I heard from students who took his class that it was quite an experience. But you said it exactly right. Is that he became a monologuist, or however you say that word. He started to deliver monologues, which is why in the piece I compare him to Mr. Kurtz from Heart of Darkness. He, and as in Apocalypse Now, which was based on Heart of Darkness, or I think this is in the book as well. One doesn't talk to Mr. Kurtz, one listens. That's the thing. But that's not, I mean, that's not the intellectual life. That is not the critical life. It's not about delivering a monologue. It is the life of a preacher, or as I said, a Sybil or an oracle.
Or a rabbi, which is what a different life of his, he would have become.
Oh, yeah.
Like a great rabbi.
Absolutely. He would have been a Talmudic prodigy. Yeah. As I say, he would have been one of these people who memorized the entire Talmud. He had that kind of incredible mind. But look, I mean, in the Talmudic tradition, it's always argument. And you always, in fact, the rabbis say you should never study the Talmud by yourself. It's always dialectical and dialogical. And the problem with Bloom is that he stopped listening to anybody. And so the last books are just one monologue after another, and it's always the same monologue. So he just became boring and tiresome. Maybe not in class. I mean, you guys were hearing his shtick for the first time.
Okay, that's
it was
true.
Very cool.
That's true, and it's possible that he was playing the hits, for a new group of 22-year-olds. No, it's funny, thinking about him as a figure of solitude, or perhaps solipsism.
Different thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Versus, well, did he? I don't know if he ever would have had used a computer or something. I think someone was telling me that he would send emails sometimes, but yeah, but also, one of the things you write about, and maybe you'll be going on for a bit now, maybe this, and there's a lot of stuff in the book we haven't touched on, but you write about why you left academia.
Yeah.
And in that essay and another one, you're very critical of the way that academia works for professors and the expectations of them, and how the things that you see as the most important parts of the university experience often don't matter at all when it comes to getting tenure or being hired. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Why I left academia, which was a fun piece to write, and I think the last one I wrote, and one that I wanted to write ever since I left academia. I should say that it just came out in Quillette, and Quillette doesn't have a paywall, so whenever this episode drops, people can go and read it. Um, yes, you raise an issue that I've been writing about and banging my head against the wall about for a long time. It's also in that more recent piece, Soul Making Studies and Liberties. It's the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the modern university. So the modern university arises in, universities have existed in the West since I think the 12th century, and they're sort of maybe similar kinds of institutions in other cultures. But the modern university is different, right? Modern university arises with modern science, but science in what used to be the broader sense, what the Germans call Wissenschaft. So it would include social science and humanities as systematic, empirical disciplines, right? Where knowledge is produced and accumulates, right? And this has a very specific historical starting point. It's 1810 in Prussia, with the founding of the university in Berlin. And that model is imported into the United States in 1876 with the establishment of Johns Hopkins, and then very quickly exist either new institutions like Stanford and the University of Chicago are created in the same model, or existing ones like the Ivy League, Harvard and Yale and so forth, pivot to this model, right? Science in every sense is gaining momentum rapidly and is becoming the basis of prosperity, of industry, of social organization. The social sciences themselves are coming into existence as disciplines at this time in the 19th century, sociology, anthropology, and so forth. And this is a tremendously powerful idea because it produces so much power. It produces so much wealth and governmental power and organizational power. So the university, the modern university, becomes this really important thing. And I'm all for what it does, the quote unquote knowledge factory. Of course I am. The problem is that the old mission of a university, or in America, a college, because we didn't have universities, was to teach undergraduates. It was to teach undergraduates, yes, you were preparing them for occupational fields, especially law and the clergy in the United States. But you were also, for lack of a better term, shaping their souls or building their characters, right? Everything that we now associate with what we call a liberal education. The problem is that mission, it's not at odds with the university mission of research, but they're just different. They come into contradiction when it becomes the sole criterion for the training and hiring and tenuring of faculty that they produce research. The research model, and it takes hold already by 1903. William James, the great Harvard psychologist, writes an essay called The PhD Octopus, and how this is sort of the PhD octopus is strangling much of what is good in higher education. Gradually, more and more over the decades, this model, like you are rewarded as a professor or prospective professor for and only for your scholarly productivity, which means not for your teaching, and specifically not for your teaching of undergraduates. So that gets neglected. And it's not a new saying that college students tend to be incredibly unhappy with the teaching they receive in college. There's a great book by a guy I know at the University of Pennsylvania called Jonathan Zimmerman. He's a historian of higher education. And I think a couple of years ago, maybe just last year, he published a book called The Amateur Hour, which is a history, I think the first history of college teaching in America. And he goes through this from the very beginning, and especially from the rise of the research university. Everyone's, large lecture halls, professors who have no charisma, overworked graduate students, or more recently adjuncts, who often resent their students because they're kind of virtual slave labor. The adjuncts are. This is my criticism, or one of my criticisms. And listen, other people have made this criticism for a long time, but the problem is the incentives remain exclusively devoted to research. I mean, schools will pretend that they care about teaching when it comes to tenure, but they don't. Basically, if you're going to get tenure anyway, then being a good teacher can help you, except you're already going to get tenure anyway. And being a bad teacher won't hurt you.
Is this different at all at a research university versus a liberal arts college?
That's a great question, because in theory it should be. And in practice, liberal arts colleges are often places that do put more emphasis on teaching. And I would say especially more emphasis on face-to-face relationships between professors and undergraduates. If you go to a research university, you might, you can wave at your professor from the back of a lecture hall. Whether it's a place like Harvard where they just don't want to have any time for teaching, or a big, public university campus where they're just giant lecture halls. If you're at a liberal arts college, you are going to have much more connected relations with your professors. But your professors were all disciplined in the same system. They went to graduate programs at research universities. They are rewarded within their disciplines for their productivity. If they ever want to get another job, they need to keep their research program going. Even, especially elite liberal arts colleges, care a lot about their professors' productivity. I interviewed for a job at Bryn Mawr where the provost made that very clear. People at Pomona have talked to me about this. So, the institutions are different in some ways, but the professors are the same. So it's not necessarily that much better.
Is there an example? I mean, is it community colleges, or where, is there an example where this doesn't matter, or in America?
Yes. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. So below the level of the research universities, and again, I'm including many of the big public universities, there's several hundred institutions that are considered quote unquote research universities, but they're like 4,000 institutions altogether. So if you're at like a branch campus of a state university, not the flagship campus, and certainly if you're at a community college, and like 40% of college students go to community colleges, it's different. But those people, because their research expectations are much lower, those faculty, their teaching loads are much higher. So typically at a branch campus, instead of teaching 2 courses a semester, you're teaching 3. At a community college, typically you're teaching 4. Sometimes it's even more, it could be 5. You don't have to worry about your research really hardly at all, but you may be really overworked and your classes are bigger because, these schools are starving for fun. So I don't mean to make it sound, listen, I make it sound like there are no good places anywhere. Like I said a long time in this conversation, it's different from classroom to classroom. And so much of it depends on who your professor is and what their commitments are, what they care about, what their passions are. But it is a phenomenon across all institutional types and throughout the history of American higher education, especially in the last 150 years, that students tend to be really dissatisfied with the teaching they're getting.
I was reminded of an anecdote that I told on a previous episode of this podcast about a couple of years ago. And it was actually with Glenn Lowry, who you
yes.
mentioned at one point in the book.
Yes.
And that is, I was talking to someone who grew up in Canada and went to college in Canada. And she was asking me, how does everyone know what it means that you went to Oberlin? Like,
Right.
how does everyone know that? And I was like, I don't, yeah, I mean, that is sort of weird, but she was like, yeah, what is, in America, in America, it seemed very alien to her.
Yeah.
The identification with one's university. And she may have been like, what does it mean that you went to Yale? And I was like, well, it's a really good college, but like, it's considered a little bit of the oddball, but like, we all have these ideas of what it means that you went to XYZ. And she was saying in Canada, this doesn't exist at all.
Yeah.
And as a, immigrant to the US, she found it confounding, not only that we all cared so much, but also that everyone quote unquote, in some sort of class strata, I guess, like knows what this means, that Oberlin represents X
Right.
and Wesleyan represents Y. Is this all like an American pathology or obsession or something that's related to the idea that we don't have landed gentry or people who we, we think because of
Right.
their birth are better than us and should have certain
Right.
privileges, and the college is in the like self-conception is the place where someone can work themselves up from their bootstraps and, make themselves at college and then go off and do whatever they want.
Yeah.
How does that strike you?
Yeah, right. That's a good question. So first of all, I mean, you did qualify it at the end about a certain class stratum. I think most Americans, and even most Americans who go to college, would not know all this stuff. It's actually one of the problems with recruiting students from poorer backgrounds is that the only schools they've ever heard of are the public universities in their state or the Ivy League schools, and they don't know anything about places like Oberlin and that it could be an option for them. But you're right, within sort of the elite educated and elite education going upper middle class, of course, everybody knows all of the narcissism of small differences between Wesleyan and Oberlin and Yale and Harvard and blah, blah, blah. And as you suggest, this is one of the big ways, first of all, that we achieve our class position, but also just the way that we define and identify ourselves. I mean, we have ethnic groups. Those are also just getting weaker. I mean, than they were back in the, sort of the immigrant. I mean, we now have new immigrants, but I mean, people are not tied to region in the way they are in other countries. I mean, they're weakly tied to region and place. People who go to these kinds of colleges move around. They go across the country and then to a third city when it's time for a job. So what is it that actually identifies them? What do they carry with them through life? That's their badge. It's the college much more than it is in other places. But I don't know what the situation is in Canada. I do know that in England, it matters a hell of a lot. I mean, Oxbridge, Oxford, and Cambridge is a whole nother thing. I mean, people are very conscious of going there or not there.
Mhm.
In France, you have the Grande École and the University of Paris, the Sorbonne. In India, you have the IITs and the IIMs, which are a huge, sort of sorting mechanism. So we're not entirely unique, but I agree. This whole, again, it's the extent to which we identify the whole school spirit, school sweatshirt, window sticker in the Volvo thing. I guess now it's a Prius. That does seem to be uniquely American.
Yeah, and this woman was saying that she said that she couldn't remember whether she had actually attended her graduation or not.
Yeah,
15 or so
there you
years
go.
later.
There you
She's like,
go.
I think I must have done something because I have the diploma somewhere, but like I don't know if I just like went later. Whereas, in America, like all sorts of graduation ceremonies are like these giant, civic events with pomp and
Yes.
circumstances and stuff. So I don't know.
And just the phenomenon of the residential college. I mean, obviously, Oxford, Cambridge, you live there, but I think my impression is, I'm not an expert on this. My impression is that for the most part, whether it's in Britain or in Canada, you're not necessarily living on campus.
Right.
Your life is not bound up with campus, and that's true of a lot of American, again, probably most American students. But the residential college, that does, and it could be Michigan. It doesn't have to be a small elite a private school. Uh, that's like a huge thing. And the experience, like just the very word college. I mean, most places don't even call it college; they call it university, right? Andrew Dobenko's book, College, what it was, what it is, what it could be, I think is the subtitle. Like just that word, just the golden glow around that word, that we understand that it means a residential experience between the ages of roughly 18 and 22 is this whole cultural construct in the United States in a way that I don't think it is anywhere else.
Right. And probably mixed up in this is America's vexed relationship to alcohol, and that in, a lot of
Yeah,
like college is the place where you can go and drink and not drive, and sort of go
interesting.
crazy in a way, and
Yes,
a lot of,
and hook up.
yeah, and it's sort of a safe, somewhat safe space in between. Whereas, other countries, maybe they're drinking, people are drinking wine as teenagers with their family at dinner. And so like the
Interesting.
prohibitionist instinct
Yeah,
in America makes it more like a forbidden kind of thing where you're binging once you get to college.
yeah.
So that probably plays
No, I
plays
think
a
that's
role
a
as
good
well.
point. Yeah.
Okay, we've been going on for a while, but do you have time to talk a little bit about the soul making studies essay?
Oh, sure. Again, it's not in the book. It's in the current issue of Liberties
Yes, and
magazine.
a link will be in the podcast description
But
to this
yes,
piece.
but it's certainly, I mean, it obviously is continuous with a bunch of the stuff that I talk about in the book, especially with respect to higher education. So please go ahead.
Well, so you're you're reviewing a couple books about great books courses that recently came
Yeah,
out, and you're also responding to a review of those books by Louis Menand. Is that how you say his name?
I
Menand,
believe so. Louis Menand. Yeah, yeah.
who wrote a piece in the New Yorker last year that sort of ridiculed the idea
Snarked on it. Yes,
of great books
that's
courses,
right.
and you are defending them.
Yes, I am.
And you mentioned St. John's, which is the most extreme version of this, I guess, because they
Yes,
also like
absolutely.
read Archimedes or something to understand
And because there are
math.
no electives, this is the entire syllabus, the entire curriculum is a great
Right.
books curriculum.
But in most places, it's more like you're reading classic works of literature and philosophy
Right.
from both antiquity and
Yeah.
Western canon.
Homer to Joyce, or Homer to Toni Morrison in the literature class, and then in the it's usually political philosophy, especially. So you go from maybe Plato or Socrates to whatever the most recent one might be, maybe Foucault or whatever.
Do you? I encourage people to read this piece, and we can't get into all of it, but
Yeah.
you offer. I mean, in some ways, this seems like the most sort of pure version of the university that you want, of young people are being exposed to the greatest works of the Western canon,
Yeah.
and with instructors who care care about it and are like committed to doing this and aren't have their own specialty or something, but they're willing to like dive into these things
Yeah.
with the students. And this is also sort of the thing that the Scott Walkers of the world would be most likely to cut from the
Yes.
budget immediately, because it seemingly it has no real practical value. And so I recommend people check this piece out, and the Manan piece. People could maybe read that before because you're responding to that,
Yeah.
and but you had an interesting. I mean, so a common critique, aside the one critique of the great book stuff is waste of time, and then the other are not practical, and then the other is dead white males.
Yeah.
And you had an interesting rebuttal to
Yeah.
the dead white males
Yeah.
one. So could
So let me
talk
just
about
say,
that.
by way of preface, I'm not saying that everyone should go to a college like St. John's where that's all you study. I do think this is a really important experience for first and second year students to have. I think in some ways it should be the core experience. But again, I mean, all the other things that you can study, I think are perfectly valid, and there is a practical purpose to going to college, and also just all of those other things are intellectually valuable, whether it's economics or physics or whatever it is. But a core course or two, like I both took and taught at Columbia. I was an undergraduate and a PhD student at Columbia. You do a year in the literature sequence. You do a year in the political philosophy sequence. There are other core courses too, but those are the most important ones. One of the books that I'm reviewing is by a guy named Roosevelt Montas, who was the director of the Center for the Core at Columbia for a while, is still involved in it. And the book's called Rescuing Socrates. And it's a great book. And it's really structured as a memoir. He comes from a poor Dominican family. He's an immigrant. And he talks about his relationship with these books and what it really means. I mean, it's the best articulation I've come across, including my own, of why and how you teach these books. Now, to the defense, dead white men. Well, first of all, I think that's just stupid as a way of dismissing anything. And implicit, aside from the hostility, implicit in that disparagement is the idea that everything that's said by dead white men is said because they are white men or dead white men, which I think
Mhm.
is an absurdity. I mean, first of all, it doesn't explain why white men disagree with each other. Like, if we're all supposed to, I mean, are the things that I say because I'm a white man, and the things that someone who's a white man who says the exact opposite of me, is that also because he's a white man? I mean, that makes no sense. but I don't even say that in the piece. What I say is, uh, we live in the West, and the West politically and imaginatively is founded on the Western tradition, whether you like it or not. So if you want to understand the world you live in, you need to understand that tradition, and the great books is kind of the central spine of those traditions. Uh, so, for example, I say it makes no more sense to me to replace Plato with Confucius at a Western university than it would to replace Confucius by Plato at a Chinese university. I'm not telling the Chinese that they should study the Western tradition. It's not their tradition. Their culture and political thought is built on a different tradition. I also say that all of those who critique the Western tradition in our universities, say the post Enlightenment thinkers, the postmodern thinkers, the feminist thinkers, what do they think they came out of? They came out of the Western tradition. In fact, they are part of the Western tradition. They are the latest chapter in the Western tradition, which has always been one of vigorous contention, just as Nietzsche, who negated the entire, in some ways, the entire previous Western tradition, or Derrida, who did the same. They were also the latest chapter in their time of the Western tradition. This is the tradition. So, to me, among other things, there seems to be this great sort of um, self-denial or self-deception on the part of those critics as to who they are themselves. Like, where do you think feminism came from? Where does modern feminism come from? Does it come out of Chinese culture? Does it come out of Indian culture? It's not that those cultures are inferior. It's just that they are different. And this is the one we had. And it's produced all of the concepts that are now being used to critique it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's I can see both sides of this, I think. And you know, you list things that were on a syllabus at a, I guess, a version of the great books
Yeah,
course that Menand himself
yeah, at
worked
Harvard.
on.
That's right. Yeah.
That, yeah, has some Confucius, had some Plato. um I mean, as we're, as Americans, we live in the Western, we're inheritors to the Western tradition. We also are, you know, uh, more and more linked to people in China who, come from a different tradition, and understanding that one would seemingly be a good thing as well if you want to understand something about that society that
I, I
is
don't
growing in
I don't
power. And
I don't disagree with that at all, but I don't think one is a substitute for the other.
mhm,
Um, I mean, yes, I don't. I'm not saying everyone has to do St. John's, where it's the whole thing is great book. And by the way, in St. John's, they do Chinese thinkers and Indian thinkers and so forth,
mhm,
but they do focus on the West. And so, but I think Columbia, we do these 2 year long courses. Maybe it needs to be more than just 4 semesters. Um, a core foundation in Western thought. And then, absolutely, you want to mandate, even require a course in non-Western thought. I have no problem with that. And not just because China's, rising as your competitor, but because, we have people in this country now from all over the world. But I'm Jewish and I come from an Orthodox background. I wouldn't put studying the Talmud on the same footing as studying Plato, even though that's the tradition that I come from, because I
mhm.
recognize that it is not the central tradition. In Israel, there's a liberal arts college now in Israel called Shalem, where their great books courses center on the Jewish tradition, as is appropriate. But we don't live there. We live here.
um okay, let's, maybe we should wrap things up. We've been going on for a while.
Yes.
Is there anything else you want to say
No, this was
before
great.
we close?
Uh,
Well, thank you for coming back on. And so the book, The End of Solitude, Selected Essays on Culture and Society, a link to the Amazon page for it will be in the show notes. And anything else you want to mention? You have a newsletter that mainly is keeping track of things that
oh,
you're
yeah. So if you
publishing.
go
Do
to
you want
my
to mention that?
website, billderesiewicz.com, you'll see a way to sign up for my newsletter. And the news, I don't write anything for the newsletter. It's just everything I publish, I send out to my list so you know that I've published it. And if you're interested in, following my writing on an ongoing basis, because I write for a lot of different places, then you can sign up for the newsletter.
Okay, well, Bill, thank you for taking the time, and thank you to all of our listeners out there. and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks very much.